So Ron DeSantis is currently in second place according to Republican primary polling. And as such, he is the second place contender for the Republican nomination, well behind Donald Trump, who is up 40 points according to essentially all the polling averages we have so far. So at this point in time, the nomination is almost a lock for Donald Trump. Again, the only reason why I don't call the primary officially is because of the volatile nature around the indictments, around the criminal charges. It just makes things a lot harder to predict, and there may be forces outside Trump's control that pull him out of the race. But for the most part, Donald Trump is on track to become the nominee. He's probably going to win the primary by a very large amount. Again, if all else stays equal, if you have all these other candidates in the race, that's certainly going to be the case. But, if it's a two-person race, you could see a much more competitive field. But nonetheless, Ron DeSantis is the second-place contender, so I figured I would do a hypothetical matchup between Ron DeSantis and Joe Biden, as we've done with Nikki Haley and Vivek Ramaswamy. And of course, we'll do with Donald Trump in a future video. So we're going to start from west to east as we typically do. But of course, before we begin, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So I think Ron DeSantis has strength among more traditional conservatives, and I think certainly some states he would outperform Donald Trump would be those Sunbelt states: Arizona, Georgia, Texas, obviously Florida. So you have a number of states, I think, in the South where I think Ron DeSantis would fare better. Nevada is one of those tricky states, though, because Nevada has gotten a lot closer in recent years with Donald Trump on the ballot. Donald Trump only lost Nevada by around 2.5 points, both in 2016 and 2020. So somebody like DeSantis, it's a bit harder to gauge. If we look back at the midterm elections, Adam Laxalt, who is somebody who endorsed DeSantis, is much more of a traditional conservative like DeSantis with sort of those MAGA tendencies. He only lost the Senate race in Nevada by 0.8%. And I think that was largely due to the fact that abortion became such a hot button issue in the midterm elections. Nevada is one of the most pro-choice states in the country. Adam Laxalt obviously being a pro-life Republican. But somebody like Ron DeSantis could conceivably do better in the Clark County area and in the Washoe County area than Adam Laxalt, specifically Washoe County, which has been drifting left the past couple of cycles. This was a county that didn't even go red for Joe Lombardo in the governor's race. So that goes to show you that this county, which was once sort of a swing county to even a red county, has been moving more towards the left. It's the second most populous county in Nevada, Clark County being the first. This is really a toss-up. If we take a look at favorability ratings, for example, Joe Biden is historically unpopular, but Ron DeSantis' favorability has also been dropping considerably. And I think part of it is because Republican voters are being turned off from him because of the primary rhetoric coming from Donald Trump. So I think in 2024, you're definitely going to see a divisive primary in the instance that DeSantis is the nominee, hurt him in some of these closer battleground states. Potentially, again, you're going to have a trade-off. You're going to have more white college-educated voters probably go over to DeSantis, but you're going to have potentially less working-class support, less of the hardcore MAGA support, since they probably won't tolerate DeSantis no matter what. So you really have to gauge what percentage of the electorate those people actually are. I suspect it's a lot smaller than people think. But if you're going state by state, it certainly could add up. Now, I'm inclined to give Joe Biden the state of Nevada very narrowly. I think Ron DeSantis would do better here than Trump 2020, but I still don't think the Republicans have enough support in the Clark County area to overcome Washoe County's leftward trend and obviously outvote the rest of the state. So as of right now, I think Nevada would narrowly go to Joe Biden. Arizona is a much more traditionally conservative state, as we were talking about. These are states where I think Ron DeSantis would perform better than Donald Trump. Going back to 2020, Donald Trump only lost the state of Arizona by 0.3. Now, since 2020, Arizona's gotten significantly bluer. Kari Lake lost the governor's race by a larger margin. Blake Masters lost the Senate race by nearly 5. So, Arizona is certainly leftward trending. Part of that is because of Trumpism and sort of the lack of appeal it has in the suburbs, but it also has to do with the fact that the demographics are just changing in these states, and as a result, that's favoring Democrats. So, somebody like DeSantis, I think he'd be able to get the margins in Maricopa County needed to win the state. He might win it outright. Again, Arizona is still a leaning Republican state. It's still a state that, by and large, Republicans have a more institutional advantage in. Obviously, that's changing very rapidly, but I still think in 2024, given Joe Biden's unfavorability ratings, and given the fact that Ron DeSantis has done more to distance himself from Trump, I actually think he'd be able to win Maricopa County, and thus I think he'd be able to flip back Arizona very narrowly. So as of right now, I think Arizona would actually go red. New Mexico would go to Joe Biden probably by a likely margin, again, similar to what we saw in 2020. New Mexico's been a very stagnant state overall. It's really not trending one way or the other. Ever since 2012, it's really been around a D plus 10, D plus 12 state, somewhere in that range. And it really hasn't fluctuated very much. You know, perhaps DeSantis could do better in Albuquerque and these other areas, improve in the rural areas, improve in Hispanic counties. But overall, it's really not going to be enough to make the state remotely competitive. So I would put it in the likely Democratic category. In the state of Texas, this is another area where I think DeSantis would do better. Again, Trump had the worst performance for a Republican nominee in Texas since 1996. He only won it by 5.6%. When we look at previous nominees for the Republican Party, Bush, McCain, Romney, they were all able to get double digits in the state of Texas. Even Trump in 2016 was able to win by 9 points. And, you know, looking at 2020, these suburban areas, specifically the Austin areas we always talk about and the Dallas-Fort Worth area, continue to trend more and more Democratic. I mean, Greg Abbott, who was able to win the state of Texas by double digits back in 2022, he even lost ground in Travis County and the surrounding area. So it's not really so much a Trump thing. It is sort of a Trump thing, the fact that Texas is trending left. It certainly makes it trend left a bit faster, but you can't really deny that the Austin area was trending left regardless. The Dallas-Fort Worth area was trending left regardless. I mean, Obama won Dallas County by a safe margin. That was a Bush County in 2004. So these trends have been happening for decades now. But demographics in Texas are making the state increasingly more difficult for Republicans to win. I think DeSantis would still win Texas by a likely margin. I think he'd win it by around 7 to 8. I don't think he'll do as worse as Trump did in 2020, but I also don't think he's going to do better than Trump 2016 here, just because Republicans have lost so much ground in these suburbs that make up such a large share of the vote there. Moving on up to Nebraska's 2nd congressional district. This is a very suburban district. The district lines are actually different than what we're seeing on the map here. YapMS has a second version that's sort of in the beta right now, so you can't really change the names of the candidates at the top, etc., etc. So I've held off on using it, but these are not the district lines for Nebraska's 2nd and Maine as well. But obviously once that program is done, we'll probably hop over there. But Nebraska's 2nd, I think, goes to Biden by a lean margin. This is a suburban district. This district has been trending left consistently. Don Bacon's really the only Republican that's been able to win here, maybe besides Ben Sasse, but he's out of the Senate now. So you do have more moderate conservatives winning here, but by and large, I think even somebody like DeSantis would probably end up losing the 2nd congressional district just based on suburban trends. You know, as this primary season has gone on, it's sort of proven the fact that DeSantis didn't really have all the muster that I think many Republicans hoped he would have going into 2024. And, you know, part of that is the fact that a lot of the Trump base is ride or die with Donald Trump at this point. I mean, you've had 8 years to really cultivate this mindset. But, you know, it's really on DeSantis as the candidate to sort of win these voters over. Moving over to Iowa, this is an area where I think DeSantis would do very well. Iowa has a pretty large evangelical population in the Northwest. Kim Reynolds won this state by around 20 points in 2022. I certainly think DeSantis could probably win this state by 12. Joe Biden's incredibly unpopular here, and, you know, DeSantis could make up ground in some of these suburban counties while doing better in the rurals. A lot of these rural counties still haven't trended as far right as they could. And I think that's something Republicans are going to benefit from in the future, because this is a state that certainly is trending in their direction. It's a 90% white state. It's a working class state. These are demographics that Republicans are just doing better with. So I think Biden in 2020 did better than he would in 2024. You had a very high turnout. You obviously had COVID being an influence. I think this time around, Iowa goes to DeSantis by a much larger margin than we saw with Donald Trump. He had about an 8-point margin. I think DeSantis could win it by 12, and as such, he'd win the state of Iowa by a safe margin. Moving up to Minnesota, this is a state that I don't think any Republican running would be able to win. I think it's probably likely Joe Biden at this point. the Minneapolis suburbs have just been trending so far to the left, and the rural areas of Minnesota really haven't been catching up. The Democratic Farmer Labor Party, which is what the Democrats are called in Minnesota, has done a really good job at messaging to white working class voters. And even though they've lost significant ground with them over the past decade or so, they're still able to win enough of a percentage of their support in order to win statewide races by pretty comfortable margins. I mean, we look back at 2022, Minnesota was not a good state for Republicans. You had the incumbent governor there win by around 8 points. You had all the other statewide offices in Minnesota go Democratic. I mean, interestingly enough, even the auditor seat, which Republicans tend to do better in auditor, treasurer races, I don't really know why. I tend to think it's because a lot of voters just sort of assume Republicans are better at handling money since they talk more about, fiscal conservatism and fiscal responsibility and things like that. But that was a race even Republicans couldn't win. This was the closest Republicans got to winning a statewide office in Minnesota in a long time. And even in this instance, it still wasn't enough. The Minneapolis suburbs, Minneapolis area is just too blue. The rural areas just aren't red enough. And as a result, you get Democratic victories again and again. So Biden would have no problem winning the state of Minnesota again, probably by a likely margin. I suspect similar to his margin back in 2020 at this point. Moving on over to the state of Wisconsin. This is a state that's been the battleground of battlegrounds. When we go back to the midterm elections, Wisconsin was one of the few states that actually gave us a split verdict in the sense that we had Republican Ron Johnson win re-election by around a point. And we also had Democratic Governor Tony Evers win by a couple of points. So you had a split verdict from Wisconsin voters, and the statewide races were the same way. You had extremely close statewide races. Attorney General went narrowly to the Democrats. Secretary of State went incredibly narrowly to the Democrats. And of course, you had the treasurer seat go narrowly to Republicans. So this is really going to be the state that I think decides the 2024 election. It's the most important state. I said last time it was probably going to be Pennsylvania back in 2020, and that was true. Pennsylvania was sort of a bellwether. Pennsylvania went to Biden, as did the election. At this point in time, Wisconsin has actually been a state that's pulled the best for Biden, both in terms of favorability and just his polling numbers. Now, Wisconsin does have a inherent Democratic bias in its polls. Republicans almost always do better than their polling. But at this point in time, I still think Joe Biden has the slight edge in the state of Wisconsin. I think when you have Republicans failing to get involved with early voting, you're going to have a divisive primary. I think Joe Biden just benefits from that. And if the economy does take a bit of an upturn going ahead of the 2024 election, he's certainly going to benefit from that. So I think Wisconsin would probably be a very close state. I think like Nevada, it would be tilt. You'd probably see under 2 points for Joe Biden, but nonetheless, I think he would win Wisconsin. And at this point, he's on track to win the election here. Moving on to Michigan, this is a state that Republicans have been let down by ever since 2016. They've been unable to win. Not only are they losing ground in more of the rural areas of Michigan, I mean, if we look at the shifts from 2016 to 2020, most of Michigan trended to the left. You did have some areas here in the central part of the state trend more Republican, but by and large, Michigan is trending back towards the Democrats. It really goes to show you that 2016 was likely a fluke for Republicans being able to win Michigan. I mean, in 2020, they did get close, and John James got very close in the Senate race, but I think going forward, you're going to see Democrats are going to solidify their support in the suburban areas. They're going to do better in the urban areas, and the rural areas are going to be about the same. So I think at this point in time, Ron DeSantis would probably lose the state of Michigan by around 5. I don't really think Biden has too much to worry about in this state. Again, we're about a year away from the election. A lot can change from now until then. But I certainly think that at this point in time, just given the fact that Republicans have been unable to get their act together, they can't choose a Speaker of the House. There's a lot of dysfunction. I really find it hard to believe that if DeSantis was the nominee, Republicans would be able to rally 110% behind him. And, with independents, again, Ron DeSantis has to run very far to the right in the primary just to win, and that's going to hurt him with independents. So Republicans are really in the worst position they could be in. Again, if Democrats were much weaker, much less unified, Republicans were united behind one candidate, this would be a lot different. But as of right now, that's not the case. And of course, in this hypothetical, DeSantis is the nominee, and he would probably lose to Joe Biden at this point in time. Moving on to Ohio, this is a state where I think DeSantis would do about the same as Donald Trump. I think he'd improve in some of the suburban areas around Columbus, Dayton, Hamilton County, maybe lose a bit of ground in the northeastern Ohio and some of the rurals, but overall, I think the margin would be about the same. I think regardless of what Republican runs, I think they're probably going to win Ohio. I mean, Ohio went to Donald Trump by 500,000 votes. You know, it's very hard to make up a margin like that in just 4 years, and Joe Biden is very unpopular in the state. I think any Republican is probably going to win Ohio, Iowa. These are states that were realigned by the 2016 election. To Trump's credit, he was able to build a new winning coalition in these states that I think lasts well beyond Trump, as we've seen in 2022. You know, DeWine winning by a landslide. That wasn't too surprising, but J.D. Vance still winning by 6 points, even though he objectively didn't really run a good campaign. So that goes to show you that Republicans have strength here because they're able to build that sort of working class, suburban coalition, and it does well for them in states like Ohio. Moving on up to the state of Maine, I think this is likely Joe Biden. I think the 2nd district is probably likely DeSantis. Not too much to talk about there. Maine's relatively stagnant. You did see Donald Trump do pretty well there back in 2016, but that was because he benefited from the vote split between Hillary Clinton and some of the third-party candidates. 2020 is much more reflective of how Maine typically votes. It's about a state that votes about 10 points for Democrats or so I think it's likely to continue in 2024. New Hampshire, I think New Hampshire could potentially trend more to the right. I think especially with DeSantis, it probably will. But I don't think it's going to really be enough for DeSantis to actually win the state. At this point in time, I think DeSantis would probably win New Hampshire by 5. He would still come up short. Again, this is a state that tends to vote against the incumbent president basically every single time since the 2000 election. Without fail. So it's probably going to be the case again in 2024. And I think DeSantis is a bit better of a candidate here. You know, Donald Trump really performed very poorly here in 2020. He lost the state by 7 points. So, you know, I really don't think a Republican is going to flip back from that unless you have a really strong Republican candidate. But as of right now, I think this state would go blue, and I think Joe Biden would hold on to it. Moving on down to Pennsylvania, the Keystone State. This is a state that Republicans have really failed to make inroads in since 2016. They got obliterated here in 2018. In 2020, they were able to flip 2 statewide offices, the state auditor and treasurer, but the most important election on the ballot, the presidential election, they weren't able to win. They lost it by 1.2. Fast forward to 2022, Republicans had an abysmal showing in Pennsylvania, just sort of proving the fact that Pennsylvania is still a state that identifies with the Democratic Party. It's very hard for Republicans to break through here. It's a close state, but I would say about 8 times out of 10, the Democrats are going to win. You know, Oz lost by 5 points in Pennsylvania. Now, Pennsylvania was a bit of a unique case because Republicans could have theoretically won this state had Doug Mastriano not been on the ballot and had Republicans been able to coalesce behind a Senate candidate very early on that was actually from the state of Pennsylvania. But nonetheless, Oz loses by 5. Doug Mastriano loses by around 15. So, you know, this is a state that, while I think it would be closer in the presidential level, I really don't see Republicans flipping the state of Pennsylvania, at least with Ron DeSantis. I don't think he has the strength in the suburbs. Again, he's a bit too traditionally conservative for a place like Pennsylvania. And, you know, if Ron DeSantis' unfavorables weren't so high, I think he probably would be able to knock it off. But right now, since his unfavorability is about where Joe Biden's is nationally, I don't think he would win the state of Pennsylvania. I think Joe Biden would probably improve in a lot of northeastern Pennsylvania and, of course, the collar counties, even if he did worse in the rural parts of the state. Moving on down to Virginia, this is a state where I think DeSantis would actually do better than Donald Trump. This is one of those more traditional conservative, and I should put conservative in quotes because Virginia is a blue state, but this is a state where you do have a sizable chunk of Republicans that will vote for Democrats if Trump or these sort of MAGA candidates are on the ballot. But somebody like DeSantis, again, he's not going to win the state of Virginia. He's not even going to get it within 5. But could he bring Joe Biden down to a 7-point margin? Probably. That's probably where I see the state of Virginia going in 2024 with DeSantis on the ticket. I think you would probably see some of the more suburban, exurban counties that Trump lost, like Stafford, Virginia Beach, Chesapeake, Chesterfield, James City County. I think you would see DeSantis win these counties, even though he would still lose the state by around 7 points. Moving on down to North Carolina, this is another state where I think DeSantis has strength. I think he could probably win the state by around 2 to 3. Joe Biden's very unpopular here. It is a stagnant state, but I think DeSantis would improve in the Wake County area. Charlotte, these more urban centers, I think he would do better in the white-collar suburbs here. I still think North Carolina would be incredibly close, even with Joe Biden on the ballot, just because you do have a large segment of North Carolina's population that's African American. They're going to stick with Joe Biden by margins, probably 90-10. So, when you have a large segment of the population that's that loyal to the Democratic Party, there's only so much a Republican could win the state by. So while I think DeSantis would win North Carolina, I don't think it would be by a very large margin at this point in time. Moving on down to Georgia, this is another more traditionally conservative Sunbelt state I think DeSantis would do better in. You take a look at the 2020 election, Donald Trump was the first Republican to lose this state since George H.W. Bush back in 1992. And he did so because he failed to perform well enough in the suburbs. He lost a lot of these suburban counties by nearly 20 points. You can't win the state of Georgia when you're losing the most populous metro in the state by large margins like this. But when we go to 2022, it's sort of the roadmap for how Republicans can win the state of Georgia. They're not going to win Cobb County back or Gwinnett County back, but they are able to improve in these counties enough to where they can win the state. Brian Kemp lost Gwinnett County by just 11 points. He lost Cobb by just 5. So that goes to show you there's still a number of Republican voters, independent voters that are willing to vote for Republicans that just aren't named Donald Trump or Herschel Walker. So I think DeSantis would probably end up winning Georgia by several points. Again, this is a state where Joe Biden, out of all these swing states, is probably the most unpopular, barring maybe Texas, and I wouldn't consider Texas a swing state. But certainly out of Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Michigan, Wisconsin, Nevada, Georgia is probably the state that's the least Biden friendly. So I think DeSantis would have no problem winning the state of Georgia by like 3 to 5 points. Finally, we move down to DeSantis' home state of Florida. This is an area where obviously I think he would do very well. I think he'd win Florida by a likely margin. Now, I know DeSantis won Florida by nearly 20 points in the governor's race last year, but that is, of course, a midterm election. It's not a presidential election. You don't have the same turnout. Democratic turnout was down consistently. You're going to have much more representative turnout in 2024 where the state actually is. And while the state is trending right, I think DeSantis would probably win Florida by around 8-10. I could not see a margin really greater than that. I mean, I have underestimated how red Florida has been in the past. I know in 2020, I only had Florida going to Donald Trump by like half a point. So I could be wrong on this, but I think as of right now, DeSantis probably wins Florida by around 10. So he would do better in Florida than in Texas. It'd be the first time Florida has voted to the right of Texas in probably decades and decades. So that's really the 2024 election, I think, between DeSantis and Joe Biden. It's a close one. I definitely think it would be closer than Donald Trump, but I certainly think DeSantis would be a stronger nominee by and large in some of these battleground states, particularly in the Sun Belt. But I think you could see him do worse in the Rust Belt. I think as any Republican is likely to do in 2024, just because Democrats have been so good at getting their acts together there, and Republicans have really just dropped the ball. Anyway, that's it for today's video. Leave a comment down below your thoughts. Like this video if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you haven't already. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.